What you see here is not an unboxing. I'm actually returning my FX30. In this video, I'm going to give you the reasons why I ended up returning my FX30 and ultimately landed on getting the FX3, which then I later returned when the new Sony ZV-E1 came out. This video is quite ironic because I ended up getting the Sony ZV-E1 in the end, and I described my situation where at the time of purchasing, I really didn't needed all those pro-grade features like dual SD card slots, but I still wanted a full-frame camera that had the versatility of a fast aperture with a zoom lens. And this is one of the things you need to consider when purchasing the FX30. So let's get right into it. Now let's go into the cons. And one major, really obvious con is the lack of a full frame sensor. So this is using a smaller sensor with a crop factor of 1.5. So when you take this full frame lens and you put it on this body, not only do you have to multiply the focal length, so let's say 24 millimeters times 1.5, you have to multiply the aperture rating, which is f2.8 times 1.5 comes up to 4.2. So you basically have a 4.2 equivalent on full frame, which doesn't give you that depth of field. It doesn't give you that blurry background. As you can see right now, I'm filming with the Sony ZV-1. Doesn't have a very good aperture, doesn't let in a lot of light, has a small 1-inch sensor. So the background, it's pretty much in focus. And that's one of the major things that I really miss coming from the Sony a7C. You can still get a mirrorless full frame camera look on your APS-C body, but you have to use it with prime lens. And if you value versatility like me, like a zoom lens, unfortunately, you have to go to full frame, and you literally have to pay more than double for the FX3 or the A7S3 to get that kind of performance and that versatility. So I think it's an utter shame that there doesn't exist a zoom lens that has a ridiculously low aperture. I mean, it's just very hard to do. The lens would become humongous. It would be really huge and would kind of defeat the purpose of having a smaller package. Another minor con is that the actual body of this FX30 is slightly heavier than the A7C. Now, when you put a actual cage on the A7C, it turns out to be almost the same weight in terms of the body to body without this having a cage at all. So the reason why I'm very concerned about weight, even in the 100 milligrams range, is that let's say I want to mount this on my tiny Crane M3, which is a very nice compact gimbal. Every little gram really counts. And I just wish the FX30 body was a little bit smaller, especially since it's an APS-C sensor. I know it's using the FX3 body, but yeah, that's just a little con for me. Oh, and I forgot to mention, when you're vlogging, you want to hold this camera, just having extra weight really hurts, especially when you have to use a zoom lens, which is slightly heavier than a prime lens. And when I'm hand holding it, it is actually quite painful, and I much prefer a smaller body weight. And this is something you would get with the Sony a7C, except the stabilization totally sucks and it doesn't have active stabilization, so you can't even vlog with it. And the last thing I want to mention that is a con with the FX30 is the fact that it doesn't have a viewfinder. So obviously the viewfinder over here. So this is the tiny viewfinder on the A7C, and when I'm taking photos, it's actually quite handy to have. I don't know why, and not having that versatility on this kind of hurts me a little bit, but honestly, I don't take a lot of photos. I do purely video, so it's just a really minor con. So the Sony FX30 does inherit a lot of features from its bigger sibling, the FX3, a lot of pro-grade features that I don't really care about. So for example, things like 10-bit all-intra codec 422, having all these different random codecs. First of all, I have to go out and buy a very expensive V90 or CF Express SD card, which is ridiculously expensive at this point, so I don't have the funds to do that. But I don't like to grade my footage. I like to shoot in standard picture profile, maybe adjust the brightness to 0, because I don't have a lot of time. I shoot on my main channel, I do tech gadget reviews and whatnot, and I don't have time to like add an extra step in my workflow. And I shoot indoors, so I don't really care about the dynamic range. Maybe with the Sony ZV-1, I should care a little bit because it does really bad with dynamic range, but these cameras are doing really good. The thing I noticed with the Sony a7C compared to the FX30 is that when I shoot in a standard picture profile, I noticed that the dynamic range just works out of the box really well, and it's slightly worse on the FX30. I noticed that too. I want to share these results in a separate video, so I will leave a link in the description to that. So another big deal with the Sony FX line is that you get things like Cine EI and shooting an S-Log3 and all those fancy stuff. And to be honest, as someone who's new to this stuff, it's quite overwhelming. I just want to shoot in the standard picture profile, like I said before, and just edit the footage and just put it out into content. I don't have time to like learn a new workflow. Maybe that's on me to learn, honestly, and this is something that I'm paying for that I just don't necessarily care. Another minor nitpick is that the 4K 120 frames per second requires a very expensive SD card, and it has a 1.5x crop, so it's probably going to look pretty soft. So it ends up being a feature that's very expensive that I'm just simply not going to use. Another couple of annoyances that I have with this camera is when I use the zoom rocker. I think that's a really cool, neat feature, especially if you have a fixed prime lens or you have limited zoom range like on this camera over here. However, the autofocus goes to very basic tracking. It just focuses on an area, so you can't pinpoint or anything like that. So I think that's really unfortunate that you can't use the clear optical zoom and then have all the benefits and features. It just, for some reason with Sony, it just seems that it's really weird that, let's say for example, you output to HDMI and then the tracking focus doesn't work. Or when you use optical clear zoom, focusing just completely falls apart. Now, I just want to emphasize, these are just really minor concerns. They're not deal breakers or any way. I just want to quickly mention that. Another thing that I find very, very annoying with the new interface, yes, it has a slightly upgraded monitor, which I don't really see 2.5 million dots. I don't see a big difference, to be honest, compared to my Sony a7C. So I wouldn't call that a big upgrade. So anyways, what really annoys me is that it doesn't show you the stabilization mode that it's on. And I think this is extremely important because when you have active stabilization on, you have that crop and you want to know if you have that crop or not. So in order to see if you have active stabilization enabled, you have to click the function menu, and then there you can see, okay, it is enabled. So let me just turn it off, for example. So another feature that people seem to be going crazy about is the fact that it has dual slots for SD cards or CF Express cards. And now this is something that I don't care about. So this relates to one of my main thoughts that I had about these cameras. One of the things that a consumer has to do in order to get the best quality is that they have to spend a lot of money to get all the features, but then they end up getting a lot of features they don't care about. Let's say like the SD cards or Cine EI or all these other pro grade features. I really wish they had a consumer camera that was more geared towards people like myself, but still didn't skimp out on things like the CPU processor. So I don't want a gimped camera that can't do 4K 60 with tracking and proxies and smartphone connection. It seems like in order to get that feature, you have to pay the full price buy this camera here instead of like, let's say a Sony ZV-1 or a ZV-E10. You can't get a smaller form factor and also premium features. You basically have to get something pretty bulky. Like this APS-C camera, that's another nitpick I have, is that even though, as I mentioned before, even though it's pretty light and small, it's still bigger than this Sony a7C, and this is an APS-C sensor. So I think they're just being a little bit lazy with the body, and I kind of wish that they had something that was super compact, but still was very snappy, had a very fast interface, had 4K 60, active stabilization, and all that stuff, but maybe one SD card, or maybe didn't have Cine EI, didn't have all those like cinema features. It would be perfect if Sony could extract all those features that we don't care about as general consumers and still provide us some good quality. So I'm still looking for a camera that's at a lower price range, but still offers premium features, and I hope they do eventually come out with that. Unfortunately, I'm stuck with the Sony FX30 at this point. So yeah, that was a little rant on what I think about the price point of this camera and how it fits in with all the other cameras. So let's talk about lens selection for the Sony FX30. This is a very important topic and something that you need to think about a lot before you purchase this camera. Now, I'm gonna go right off the bat and say that this Sigma 24-70 is fantastic because it's an art lens. It's super expensive. It's very, very heavy and bulky, which I absolutely hate. You can't take this out anywhere. It's going to fall off a tripod if you want to mount it in like more precarious positions. So if you want that full frame look, you can get a prime lens like this one over here, this Sony G 1.4 15 millimeter, except this is a weird lens where it's not wide enough to do vlogging, but it's also not tight enough to give you kind of a nice, less distorted face look. So if you're filming like a talking head shot, it still looks kind of like distorted-ish. So this is kind of like Malcolm in the middle. It's a really good lens. I really like that it goes down f1.4. In fact, has more blur than this camera because when you multiply 1.5 times 1.4, you get 2.1. So this actually ends up being faster than this lens, which is f2.8. So you get even more background blur and more light. And sometimes there's just too much light and I need to use an ND filter and it just becomes too much of a hassle. So I actually went out and got this one instead, the Tamron 11-20 f2.8. Now it's slightly bigger and bulkier, but it does have a zoom range that is more applicable for my use cases. So you can go all the way down to 11, which is really weird because it actually zooms out when it wants to go for a wider shot, which is atypical from this type of lens where it's the opposite. And you can go all the way to 20 millimeters, which is about a 30 millimeter focal equivalent on full frame. And that has less distortion. It kind of compresses the background a little bit, and it helps you with more of that product B-roll shots. Now, this is not perfect. Obviously, f2.8 translates to f4.2 on full frame equivalent. So you're not going to get that nice separation from the background. You're not going to get that nice bokeh. And in terms of the sharpness, you'll see my test later when I publish the video that this camera, this A7C with full frame, the Sigma 24-70 art lens, is much sharper than this one over here, which is extremely unfortunate. Like, I'm really sad that I'm sacrificing optical quality for form factor and features and stuff like that. If I were to restart and do this all again, I would return the FX30, return all these lenses, APS-C lenses, sell this Sigma, this really fat, heavy Sigma lens that I hate. I can never take it out because it's so thick and fat and heavy. And also sell this body, which has diminished in value so much. Now it's selling on the secondary market for basically nothing now. Anyways, I would take all that, put all that cash in an FX3, and then buy the Tamron 20-40 f2.8 full frame lens. So it's pretty much the same size as this lens, except it's full frame, and it goes from 20 to 40, which is a very nice range. You get more of a standard look, so you look a little bit nicer when you use the 40 millimeter, and then on the 20 millimeter end, it's quite wide enough. I don't need it this wide. So honestly, this all goes into my theme of buy nice or buy twice, and it's true. If I were to go back in time and if I knew that I would continue this YouTube content creation, I really wish I just bought the Sony a7S III. Obviously, the FX3 came out a little bit later, but I really needed to upgrade for better autofocus from the Panasonic systems, and I kind of just I didn't want to pay the price up front, the 5,000 Canadian dollars, to get this A7S III. But 2 years later, I want to sell this A7C. Is just not very usable because it's very slow, has a bad interface. It doesn't have stabilization or 4K 60. Like, the CPU is very slow and all that stuff. And I just wish I can go back in time and just buy the A7S III, put up that cash up front. But then again, I'm in this weird predicament where I can have two camera bodies for the price of one really good camera body. And then I can have this fixed stay at home, and I can have this on the go kind of run and gun setup. So to me right now, I'm going through gear acquisition syndrome, and it's very hard to choose on what to do. Unfortunately, the optics are not as good as the FX30, which you'll see in my comparison video. And it really pains me and it hurts me, the fact that I still have to take this out and, shoot B-roll products in this little tiny studio apartment. And I kind of just wish I had one camera, to be honest. It's a very annoying situation where I'm in, but there is some benefit to having two cameras. Obviously, you diversify your assets. Maybe you go outside and you drop your Sony FX3 and it smashes on the ground or someone steals it. At least you have a camera at home. So there's pros and cons. I would love to hear your comments about what you think about my situation. How are you going to be affected by if you're going to buy the FX30? Do you still want it after all these points I made? Or are you just going to go and save up and buy the full frame equivalent? Like they said, buy nice or buy twice. Anyways, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.